Hello everyone, welcome to the Animal Zone with Professor Monzon. Today we discuss animal ecology. Like with other topics, we're really just going to scratch the surface of animal ecology. I also teach a course in ecology, so we could spend 15 weeks on this. But today we're just going to spend a few minutes introducing the topic. We will spend our time following the outline of Hickman's Integrated Principles of Zoology, chapter 38, where I will begin talking about the hierarchical nature of ecology, then just focus on one aspect of ecology, population ecology, and then I'll end with some brief comments on extinction and biodiversity. So what is ecology? Well, ecology, the logi is the study of, the eco comes from the Greek word oikos, so which means home. So ecology is the study of the home, but specifically it is a comprehensive science of the relationship of the organism to the environment. Charles Darwin was an ecologist, but for most of his life the word didn't exist because his contemporary Ernest Haeckel was the one that coined the term in 1866. Ecology may be studied at various levels in the hierarchy of biological organization. So this figure, for example, shows a hierarchy from tissue all the way to the biosphere. It's not complete because we know that even on this side of the hierarchy, there are more levels. For example, there's cellular and even subcellular, like organelles, and even smaller than that, there is molecular biology. And maybe there's even a level higher than the biosphere if there happens to be life outside of Earth. But generally, ecology goes from organisms to the biosphere. Today, we're really just going to focus on population ecology for most of this lecture. Okay, so ecology is the study of organisms to their environment. The environment may include abiotic factors and biotic factors. Abiotic factors are not alive. They are things like sunlight and heat or air or water or chemicals in their environment. And the biotic factors are things that are alive, basically other organisms. Those organisms may be competitors, they may be in the same or different species, they may be predators or hosts or parasites or microbes. So for example, here we see this fish swimming around in its natural habitat. Maybe this is a mangrove, I don't know. And so this is an important concept in ecology. What is the habitat? The habitat is the physical space where an animal lives as defined by that animal's normal activity. Yesterday, I was skating around here and I was nearby in a parking lot and I almost skated over a frog. Well, the frog was living in that space, but a parking lot is not part of its normal habitat. So we picked it up and moved it to what would be a more appropriate habitat for the frog. Now let's continue talking about habitat because habitat is defined by the resources and conditions that are there for the animal in question. And we can define resources as finite assets of the environment which are consumed by organisms in the course of their reproduction, in contrast to conditions which are physico-chemical features of the environment that influence the functioning of organisms but are not consumed nor used up by the activities of organisms. So you can think of several resources, I'm sure, and several conditions. It kind of depends on the organism because something like sunlight would be a condition for animals, but it could be a resource for plants because plants do consume photons. But in general, conditions are not consumed. So things like pH, salinity, temperature, those are all conditions, whereas food or space for shelter or burrowing holes or water, those would be resources. Now this brings us to a related but to a concept that's related to the habitat but distinct. That is the concept of the niche, which is the multidimensional relationship of an organism to its environment, comprising its usage of resources and its tolerance for certain conditions. So for example, in this figure, we have a fish, and the figure shows the three-dimensional volume of the niche of this fish as defined by three different variables: temperature, salinity, and pH. So this fish can only tolerate this range of temperatures and this range of pH in the water and this range of salinity. So those tolerances define its niche. Now, many people use the terms habitat and niche interchangeably, but technically that is incorrect because habitat is a physical place. It is where the organism actually is, whereas the ecological niche is not a physical place, it's more of an abstract idea. It is a summary of the organism's tolerances and requirements. Now, having said that, we also need to distinguish between the fundamental niche and the realized niche. The fundamental niche describes an animal's potential to live within a wider range of suitable conditions, theoretically, in the absence of biotic interactions. However, the realized niche is the narrower subset of suitable conditions where an animal actually exists. And it is narrower because the realized niche is constrained by biotic interactions. So for example, in the rocky intertidal, why are some animals not where they could be? Well, it's usually because of competition. So for example, if you see a rock that's in the intertidal zone and you think, well, why is that a rock not covered by sea anemones when the sea anemones could in theory live there? Well, it's probably because the rock space has been taken over by maybe a more superior competitor like mussels. All right, let's talk about populations. What is a population? Here I took this photograph of a population of sandhill cranes in Colorado, but how do we define a population? A population is a group of individuals of one species in one area. Although the size and the nature of the area is defined somewhat arbitrarily for the purposes of the study being undertaken. So what is the population, or what are the boundaries, the spatial boundaries of the population of sandhill cranes here? Is it the wildlife refuge where we are, or is it maybe a network of refuges? That's somewhat arbitrarily defined. Although in some cases it's defined more clearly. For example, if you have a population of Galapagos finches in an island of the Galapagos, that is the population. So populations have emergent properties that are not present in lower hierarchical levels, and that tends to be true for all hierarchical levels, right? So communities have emergent properties not present in populations, and ecosystems have emergent properties not present in communities. So populations have emergent properties not present in organisms, such as growth rate or survivorship, age structure, sex ratio, and genetic diversity. Think about it. Organisms don't have a survivorship rate. They are either alive or they're dead, but they don't have a rate. Similarly, an organism does not have an age structure. It has one age. So an age structure is really just a property of many individuals of that population. Or one individual does not have a sex ratio. Sex ratio is a property of the population. Let's look at this survivorship, this graph of 3 survivorship curves. These are 3 hypothetical survivorship curves that measure survival over time with age of an individual. So in survivorship curve 1, most individuals stay alive for a long time until they get really old and then they start dying more quickly. This is more typical of animals like humans or long-lived animals that have high survival rates of their young. Survivorship curve 2 is one in which there's a more constant rate of mortality with age. A lot of birds have survivorship curves that are similar to this one. And survivorship curve 3 shows very high mortality early in age and little mortality later in life. There are many animals, especially invertebrates, that produce high quantities of offspring, and most of them die really early on, and a few of them survive, but if they survive, they can grow to be pretty old. So a lot of invertebrates, some fishes also have survivorship curves like this, and even some tetrapods like sea turtles. This graph over here describes or shows the age structure of the human population in Mexico in 2 different time points, 1975 and 2005. And you could see that in the 30 years that spanned, the age structure shifted. The population is older, so the average age of the Mexican population is older. There's also less children proportionally. And this kind of a shift is typical of developing countries where access to quality healthcare and quality nutrition allows people to grow older, and access to educational and professional opportunities, especially for women, decrease the birth rate. Do you remember this guy? Thomas Malthus. He was an influencer of Charles Darwin when through his essay on the principle of population. He basically noted that all populations have an inherent ability to grow exponentially. It means really, really quickly. And we can call that intrinsic rate of increase R. So let's do a little bit of math here. Let's create a model of population growth in continuous time. Let's call the population size n, the number of individuals. And let's call the rate of increase r. R is the instantaneous growth rate. This is basically the birth rate minus the death rate per unit time. But if the unit of time is infinitesimally small, that means we have to resort to some calculus. So let's call the rate of growth dn dt, right? Delta n, so the change of the population size over the change of time. Well, dn dt, the population growth, is equal to Rn. Basically, it means that the population will grow at a rate proportional to how many individuals there are already in the population times that intrinsic rate of growth. Now, I won't derive this, but basically we can solve for n at any future time point t using this equation. N of t is equal to n0, the population at any given starting point, times this funny constant e. Remember what e is? It's like 2.718. raised to the exponent, which is the product of the intrinsic rate of growth and the number of time steps that we're trying to project. Okay, let's try to do a problem. So there was a population of 31 musk oxen that was reintroduced to Nunivak Island, which is an island here off the coast of Alaska, and that occurred in 1936. This is a true story. A couple of decades later, the official population count was 514. So population ecologists can calculate the rate of increase R, and they calculated it to 0.138. Now you can use the formula for projecting the future population size for the current time, 2020. So if you have a calculator handy, you can do the math. And if you were just to calculate it 1 year into the future, let's say 1966, you will see that there were likely to be 590 muskoxen. And 2 years into the future, so 1967, there should be about 677 muskoxen. If you do 5 years into the future, in 1970, there should be about 1,024 musk oxen. But if you project to now, 2020, which is 55 years later, you should come up with a projected abundance of about 1,016,053 musk oxen. So literally that island is overrun with musk oxen. Do you know how many there are now? Well, certainly not a million. There's more like 1,000, right? So what happened? The model was wrong, or the model was not realistic. Maybe it was realistic in the first few years, but the further away we tried to project, the more unrealistic it became. And that's because even though every species has the intrinsic potential to grow exponentially, they don't. Why? Because there's a cap. There's a limit to how large a population can get. In the case of the muskoxen, well, there literally isn't enough space. And we saw from our previous lesson on animal behavior that muskoxen butt heads. So there's a lot of competition. So we need another model. We need a model that can capture the reality that all populations have a ceiling. We call that ceiling a carrying capacity. Let's call that K. K is the maximum population size that can be supported by a given environment. And so we take our first model, dNdt equals Rn, and we modified it. We modify that growth rate to be modulated by this fraction that incorporates a carrying capacity. If we look over here, we see that exponential model, dNdt equals Rn, will behave like this. It'll just keep going and going and going and going. But the newer model that incorporates the reality of a carrying capacity behaves like this. The population will grow and grow and grow and grow, but as it approaches carrying capacity, its slope, dNdt, or its growth rate, begins to slow down until dNdt equals 0. So I want you to understand what happens in these different scenarios. What happens when k equals n? If you do the math, you should be able to see what happens when k equals n. Or what happens when k exceeds n. And even though this is just theoretically, the curve won't be able to pass k, in reality, an animal population can exceed its carrying capacity. And so what would happen if k is less than n? Here are some examples. This is an example of a sheep population that was introduced into some island, I think in New Zealand. And you see that here, for the first few decades, there was some exponential growth. And then in this case, the sheep population exceeded its carrying capacity and then came down, and then came up, and then exceeded carrying capacity again, and so on. And so these fairly stable cycles indicate that this population was controlled by humans. Humans essentially dictated the carrying capacity that they can tolerate on that island. When we look at this, at the growth curve of this ring-necked pheasant also on an island, we see that there's exponential growth early on, and then that growth slows down until it comes to a halt, and then the population actually starts shrinking, and then it rebounds, and then it shrinks again. But what's going on? How come it didn't rebound all the way to that first peak? Same thing happened here. It rebounded, but why didn't it rebound to over here where the first peak was? Well, that's probably because carrying capacity itself is changing. Remember, carrying capacity is not some sort of immutable property of the environment. Carrying capacity, for example, for a pheasant is probably related to its food resources. And its food is also an organism that is also subject to its own carrying capacity. So whatever this bird eats may itself be fluctuating up and down. And when we look at this figure of the human population, we'll see that the human population has been fairly stable for a really, really long time until, boom, the Industrial Revolution permitted the human population to take off. What happened? Literally, humans increased their own carrying capacity by increasing resources. How far this will go? Well, we don't know. There are many different models that have many different assumptions about mortality rates and birth rates, but it's growing. It's still growing exponentially. So all of those that I discussed just now, we call that density dependent regulation. Essentially because, let me show you, because the density N itself regulates the growth rate, right? Conversely, the growth rate depends on the density. However, sometimes population growth rate, the NDT, is affected by factors other than the population size, like, well, other species, other populations. For example, interspecific ecological interactions such as interspecific competition or predation or parasitism can limit population growth. And sometimes there are even abiotic regulators that are independent of a population's density, like natural disasters that can sometimes eliminate an entire population regardless of how many individuals there were. All right, let's finish out this lesson by talking a little bit about biodiversity and extinction. Why is there biodiversity in the first place? Well, biodiversity exists only because speciation rates have exceeded extinction rates throughout Earth's history. Think about it. If all animal species descended from a single common ancestor, that means that speciation must have outpaced extinction. Speciation rates vary among animal taxa, and based on the fossil record, we can calculate it crudely, and speciation rates typically range between 0.2 to 0.4 speciation events per species per million years. Similarly, extinction rates also vary a lot, ranging from 0% to 96% per million years during the Phanerozoic, which is the entire span of time that animals have been on Earth. But the average about 25%. So this is a figure from the text that shows the distribution of species extinction rates per million year intervals. And you see that in some million year intervals, there was very little extinction. And in a few million year intervals, there was a lot of extinction, almost in the 90% and more. But the average is about 25% per million years. Okay, so I said that speciation rates vary and extinction rates vary. Do those rates tend to be correlated or not? Well, sort of. Interestingly, well, sort of they are correlated. Interestingly, small geographic ranges and fragmented habitats are associated with both increased rates of local extinction and increased rates of speciation. Take, for example, this figure from chapter 6, the evolution chapter. If we look at these two lineages of African antelopes, we see this interesting pattern. There is the lineage of the modern impalas, and there's a separate lineage of the modern blesboks, hartebeests, and wildebeests. You see that there's only one species of impala, but there used to be two. So that means that there was one speciation event here, but then this species went extinct. So it's low speciation, low extinction, which contrasts with what happened in the other lineage. You see that this is a very branching pattern, indicating there were many speciation events, but many of those species went extinct, and then there are only a few left. So this lineage experienced high speciation rates and high extinction rates. So this presents sort of a paradox. How do you explain this paradox of biodiversity? I will let you do the reading and find out on your own. It's really interesting. So are we experiencing a mass extinction? I've mentioned this earlier in the semester. In fact, these facts I've stated earlier, that the fossil record shows that more than 99% of species that have ever existed are now extinct. From the fossil record, we can calculate a natural background rate of extinction rates, and that's about 0.001 to 0.01% per century. We can also calculate a current rate of extinction based on the last few centuries, and that rate is alarmingly high. It's about 1% per century, which is 100 to 1,000 times the natural background rate. This is what's going on right now. We're losing about 1% of species per century. Now, it's difficult to compare what's going on now with the rates that were calculated from the fossil record, because the rates calculated from the fossil record obviously were calculated more crudely, right? When we talk about extinctions per unit time, that unit time from the fossil record, that denominator is much longer time span. So these extinction rates are per million years. So for example, I've mentioned that the big five mass extinctions, where extinction rates exceeded 75%, among them, the most cataclysmic one was the Permian mass extinction. But again, this is calculated for a million years. So if you do the math, you try to translate what's going on now per century to what's happened in these five extinctions per million years, you could see that what's going on now, it rivals even the most cataclysmic of the previous 5 mass extinctions. What's happening now is sort of on the same order of magnitude as the Permian mass extinction, which is scary. So hopefully we humans will learn to curb our own activities so that we don't create the conditions that promote extinction. So this is the end of our exploration of Hickman's integrated principles of zoology. There's one more lesson on animal conservation that is not part of the textbook, and make sure that you check out those slides and that video. And until next time, remain strong and courageous.